The people who disappeared near Blackmire Marsh were never truly found. Not because no one searched for them, but because the marsh always gave something back. A fishing boat, a lantern, sometimes a torn net drifting silently across the water. Everything, except the person. For more than 60 years, the people living nearby have refused to enter the marsh after sunset. Officially, no one has ever explained why. Unofficially, everyone tells the same story. They believe something beneath the water waits patiently for one simple mistake. And once it notices you, it never truly lets you leave.
You should not watch alone. Like, subscribe, and share with our loving friends.
If you enjoy realistic horror stories inspired by unexplained events, subscribe to Horror Story World. Because tonight's story isn't just about a disappearance, it's about something that may still be waiting beneath the water. Northern Scotland, autumn, 1961. Blackmire Marsh stretched across miles of dark wetlands beneath a sky that never seemed completely clear. Even during the day, a thin blanket of mist floated just above the water, hiding whatever rested below. The marsh wasn't abandoned. People still fished there. Entire families had earned their living from those waters for generations. But every local respected one unwritten rule: leave before sunset. Thomas Reed never followed it. At 39 years old, Thomas had spent most of his life fishing the marsh. He wasn't reckless. He simply trusted experience more than old legends. To him, every strange story had a logical explanation. Every missing fisherman had simply made one fatal mistake. That's what he believed. Until the night everything changed. Late that afternoon, something felt different. The wind had disappeared. The reeds stood perfectly still. No birds crossed the sky. Even the insects had fallen silent. It wasn't peaceful. It felt as though the entire marsh were listening. At the old wooden dock, an elderly fisherman named Graham watched Thomas prepare his boat. Fishing rods, fuel, a lantern, a flashlight, a thermos filled with hot coffee. Everything looked normal. Everything, except the silence between them. After several long moments, Graham finally spoke. "You shouldn't stay out there tonight." Thomas smiled without looking up. "You've been saying that for years." "This time is different." Thomas secured another rope inside the boat. "What makes tonight different?" Graham never answered immediately. He simply stared across the motionless black water. Then, without taking his eyes off the marsh, he quietly said, "When the water becomes this still, it usually means something underneath has already awakened." Thomas forced a quiet laugh. Not because he found the old man ridiculous, but because he didn't want to admit those words unsettled him. A few moments later, he untied the boat, started the engine, and slowly disappeared into the growing fog. The people standing on the dock watched the lantern drift farther and farther away, smaller, dimmer, until the light vanished completely. No one could tell whether the lantern had gone out, or whether the fog had simply swallowed it whole. Hours later, Thomas reached the old wooden fishing platform deep inside Blackmire Marsh. The night had grown colder. Moonlight reflected across the perfectly still water like polished glass. There wasn't a single ripple, not a bird, not an insect, only silence. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Thomas tied the boat to one of the weathered wooden posts, prepared his fishing line, and cast the bait into the darkness below. Minutes passed, nothing moved. Then, without warning, a single bubble rose slowly to the surface. Then another. Then another. They weren't random. They formed a perfectly straight line beneath the platform, as though something unimaginably large, had just taken its first breath beneath the water. Thomas slowly reached for his flashlight. The beam pierced through the mist, then disappeared into endless blackness. No fish, no movement, nothing. He lowered the flashlight, took one slow breath, and quietly convinced himself there was nothing there. He never realized. That far below the platform, hidden beneath the dark water, two enormous shadows had already begun circling him. The mist had grown even thicker. Although half the moon still hung above Blackmire Marsh, its light never reached the water below. Thomas remained exactly where he was. His fishing rod hadn't moved once. Nights like this were rare. Normally, by now, even the smallest fish would have tested the bait. Tonight, the entire marsh seemed to be holding its breath. He slowly unscrewed his thermos and took a sip of coffee. Then, without warning, small circles began spreading across the surface of the water, one after another, not in one place, but all around him, as though something enormous was moving slowly beneath the marsh. Thomas raised his flashlight. The beam disappeared into the dense fog. All he could see were broken streaks of silver dancing across the water. Then, everything stopped. Silence returned. He let out a quiet laugh. "You're getting old, Tom," he muttered to himself. "You're starting to see ghosts where there aren't any." The words had barely left his mouth. Thud. A heavy impact slammed into the underside of the platform. The old wood shuddered beneath his feet. Thomas froze. Slowly, he knelt beside the edge and looked down. Black water, nothing else. Then, thud. Even harder this time. It sounded as if something beneath the platform had struck the wood with its head. Thomas reached for the long iron gaff resting beside his tackle box. Who's there? He already knew. No one was going to answer. Still, people ask impossible questions when fear begins replacing logic. The marsh remained silent. Then somewhere in the distance, a single bird exploded into the night sky, its frantic wings breaking the silence for only a moment. And then, nothing. Midnight came quietly. At last, Thomas felt the first pull on his line. It was gentle, almost playful, like a small fish testing the bait. He slowly lifted the rod. The line felt heavy, far heavier than it should have. Yet, whatever was below wasn't moving. It felt less like a fish, and more like he'd hooked a fallen tree buried beneath the water. He pulled harder. Suddenly, the weight vanished. The line became weightless. The bait emerged from the darkness. But something was wrong. The thick steel hook had been bent completely out of shape. Not broken, bent, as though someone had squeezed solid metal with their bare hands. Thomas stared at it for several long seconds. A cold feeling settled deep inside his chest. No fish could have done that. He quietly replaced the ruined hook. Then, the rope securing his boat suddenly tightened by itself. The boat began drifting away from the platform. There was no wind, no current, nothing pushing it. Thomas grabbed the rope and pulled. It felt as though something on the other end was pulling back. He planted his feet and pulled with everything he had. Without warning, the resistance disappeared. The boat shot backward and slammed violently into the platform. Bang! Thomas nearly lost his balance. For the first time that night, real fear settled across his face. There was no one there, nothing he could see, and yet, something was undeniably there. Hours slipped by, the darkness deepened. Then, far beyond the fog, a faint lantern appeared. Someone was approaching. Relief washed over Thomas. "Who's out there?" he called. He raised one hand and waved. "Hello?" No answer. The light kept coming closer, closer, but there was no boat, only the lantern, floating, as though it were drifting through the air by itself. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. He shouted again, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, without warning, the lantern vanished. The light simply disappeared. The marsh was swallowed by darkness once again. At that exact moment, Thomas felt it, directly beneath the platform, deep below the black water. Something was rising, very, very slowly. Thomas didn't move. His flashlight remained fixed on the water beneath the platform. The beam reached only a few feet below the surface, before it was swallowed by darkness. Then, a single bubble surfaced, another, then dozens more, slowly, quietly, as though something enormous below had just exhaled. A chill crawled up Thomas's spine. He took one cautious step backward. The old platform creaked beneath his boots. The sound was small, but the marsh answered. The tall reeds began swaying. Not with the wind. There wasn't any. They moved, as though something unseen had brushed past them. Then, a strange sound drifted through the fog. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't even human. It sounded like someone deep beneath the water, trying to imitate a human voice. Thomas gripped the flashlight tighter. His heartbeat became painfully loud. He had spent nearly 20 years fishing these wetlands. He had heard storms. He had heard predators. He had heard dying animals. But he had never heard anything like this. He made his decision. It was time to leave. Immediately. He hurried back toward the boat. His hands shook as he reached for the ignition. One pull, nothing. A second, still nothing. A third, silence. The engine refused to start. Only an hour earlier, it had been running perfectly. Then, behind him, a soft sound. Tap. It came from the platform. Thomas slowly turned around. No one was there, but the wooden boards were wet. Fresh footprints stretched across the platform, one after another. Each print glistened in the moonlight, as though something soaking wet had walked toward him, then vanished before reaching the boat. Thomas stopped breathing. The prints didn't look human. They were longer, narrower, and strangely distorted, as if they had been left by something that had only learned what human feet were supposed to look like. The silence became unbearable. Then, his fishing line tightened, by itself. The rod hadn't moved, no fish was pulling it, yet the line slowly slid across the platform, toward the edge. Thomas watched in disbelief. The line continued moving, inch by inch, until it slipped beneath the black water. Nobody was holding it, nothing was visible. And yet, something below was pulling, slowly, patiently, as if inviting him closer. Thomas reached into his pocket, pulled out a folding knife. Without hesitating, he cut the line. The instant the line snapped, the remaining length disappeared beneath the surface with terrifying speed. Gone, in less than a second. Thomas stared into the darkness. If he hadn't cut it, whatever was below would have pulled him in instead. Silence returned. Everything became still once again. Too still. Thomas climbed into the boat. He pulled the starter cord one last time. The engine roared to life immediately, as though nothing had ever been wrong. He wasted no time. The boat eased away from the platform, slipping quietly through the fog. For nearly 100 feet, everything seemed normal. Then, without warning, the engine died. The boat drifted to a stop. No wind, no current, nothing. Then it began to turn, slowly. One full circle, then another, then another. Thomas grabbed an oar and tried to fight the movement. It barely touched the water. It felt as though something beneath the surface was spinning the boat from below. Then, on the starboard side, the water bulged upward. A massive black shape rose just beneath the surface. It never broke through. It never made a sound. It simply passed beneath the boat, so enormous that Thomas couldn't see where it began or where it ended. Every instinct told him to look away. He couldn't. Then, from somewhere deep inside the fog, a child's voice, soft, fragile. "Help!" Thomas froze. A few seconds later, the voice returned. "Please." His pulse quickened. No child could survive alone in the middle of Blackmire Marsh. Not at this hour. His mind screamed that it was impossible, but his heart wanted to believe otherwise. Then, a small wooden rowboat slowly emerged from the mist, motionless, drifting without a sound. A little girl sat inside. Her head hung low. Long, wet hair covered her face. She never moved, not even once. Thomas instinctively reached for the throttle and slowly turned his boat toward her. He had no way of knowing that this single decision would become the beginning of the oldest mystery Blackmire Marsh had ever known. Thomas slowed the boat. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave, to get as far away from Blackmire Marsh as possible. But another voice inside him refused. If there really was a child out there, he couldn't abandon her. The distance between them closed. 30 feet, 20, 15. The little girl never moved. Her head remained lowered. Long strands of wet hair hid her face. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help again. She simply waited. Thomas eased the throttle back. The boats were now only a few feet apart. "Hey," he called softly. "Are you all right?" No answer. Only silence. He reached out, trying to steady her drifting boat. The instant his hand touched the old wood, the rowboat was empty. Thomas stumbled backward. His flashlight swept across the boat. No child, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The small boat rocked gently, then slowly drifted away into the fog. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He knew what he had seen. He knew someone had been sitting there. Then, a voice whispered directly behind him. "Thomas." His entire body locked. He knew that voice. It was impossible. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned around. No one. Only darkness. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. Gentler. "Thomas." His breathing became shallow. It wasn't just a familiar voice. It was Alice, his wife. She had died 2 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Thomas hadn't heard her voice since the day she passed away. Yet now, it sounded exactly as he remembered. Warm, soft, almost comforting. "I've missed you," the voice whispered. For one brief moment, Thomas forgot where he was, forgot the marsh, forgot the warnings, forgot the impossible things he had already witnessed. His eyes filled with tears. Then, Graham's words echoed inside his mind. When the marsh becomes this quiet, something underneath has already awakened. Thomas shut his eyes. He covered his ears with both hands. "No," he whispered. "You're not Alice." The voice stopped. Everything became silent again. Then, without warning, the entire boat lurched violently. Something massive passed beneath it. A powerful wave lifted the hull before dropping it back into the water. Thomas grabbed the side of the boat to keep from falling. His flashlight slipped from his hand. It rolled across the deck, its beam sweeping across the water. For less than a second, he saw it. A colossal shape beneath the surface. Longer than the boat itself. Its skin looked pale gray beneath the moonlight. Several long whisker-like tendrils drifted around its head. Then, its eyes. They weren't glowing. They weren't monstrous. They looked almost human. Cold, expressionless. Watching him, the creature continued gliding beneath the boat, without making a single sound. Then it disappeared into the darkness. Thomas couldn't breathe. His mind searched desperately for a logical explanation. There wasn't one. A violent crash suddenly shook the boat. Bang! Something had struck the hull. Hard. Another impact followed immediately. The wooden boards groaned. A thin stream of icy water began pouring through a crack near the stern. Thomas rushed to restart the engine. One pull. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. Then, the boat shook again. This time, the crack widened. Water rushed inside. Thomas pulled the starter cord with every ounce of strength he had left. The engine finally roared to life. Without looking back, he pushed the throttle forward. The boat surged across the dark water. The shoreline was still hidden beyond the fog, but he didn't care where he was going anymore. He only wanted to leave. For nearly a minute, nothing followed. Then, against every instinct, Thomas glanced over his shoulder. His heart stopped. There were no waves, no splashes, no sound. Yet beneath the perfectly smooth surface, a massive shadow was keeping pace with the boat, not chasing him, not attacking, simply following, as though it already knew. He wasn't leaving Blackmire Marsh. Blackmire Marsh was leaving with him. Thomas kept the throttle wide open. The engine screamed through the silence. Cold air whipped across his face, but he never eased his grip on the wheel. He refused to look behind him again. Whatever had followed him beneath the water, he didn't want to know if it was still there. The shoreline had to be close, it had to be. Then, without warning, bang! A violent impact slammed into the underside of the boat. The entire hull lurched into the air. Thomas was thrown against the console. The engine sputtered, then died. Silence. Absolute silence. The boat drifted helplessly across the black water. Thomas grabbed the starter cord. One pull. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. Then, the surface around the boat began to change. Tiny bubbles rose from every direction. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. The water looked as though it had begun to boil. Thomas stared into the darkness. His breathing became shallow. A slow scraping sound drifted across the hull. Skrrr. It started near the bow, moved along the side, then disappeared beneath the stern. Something was touching the boat. Not attacking, exploring, feeling every inch of the wood. The sound came again. Closer. Slower. Almost curious. Thomas clenched his jaw. Every instinct told him not to look, but fear has a way of forcing people to do exactly what they shouldn't. He slowly leaned over the side. The flashlight trembled in his hand. Its beam slipped beneath the surface. At first, nothing. Then, two enormous eyes opened in the darkness. They didn't glow. They simply reflected the moonlight. Cold, ancient, patient. The creature was closer than he had imagined. Its head alone was nearly as large as the boat. Long whisker-like tendrils drifted through the water. Its pale gray skin was covered in old scars, as though it had survived for centuries. Then, its mouth began to open. There were no sharp teeth, only countless rows of thin, inward-pointing bones, like a living trap. Anything pulled inside would never come back out. Thomas couldn't move. The creature watched him. Seconds passed. Neither of them moved. Then, the creature slowly closed its mouth and disappeared beneath the boat. Thomas blinked, confused. Why hadn't it attacked? Before he could answer that question, a distant church bell echoed across the marsh. Dong. A long pause. Then another. Dong. 3 slow chimes. 3 o'clock. The sound rolled across the water, and something changed. The bubbles stopped. The water became still. The unbearable pressure surrounding the boat vanished. The engine suddenly coughed back to life. Thomas didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle forward. The boat surged toward shore. Minutes later, the first outline of the dock appeared through the fog. Lights, people, safety. He had made it. or so he believed, as the boat drifted alongside the dock. The waiting crowd didn't look at Thomas. Every face was fixed on something behind him. No one spoke. No one moved. Their expressions were filled with pure horror. Thomas slowly turned around. His blood ran cold. Across the weathered wooden deck, stretching from the stern to the center of the boat, were enormous wet handprints. Not human. Each finger was unnaturally long, thin, almost skeletal, as though something had climbed aboard, stood only a few feet behind him, and remained there, watching him the entire way back to shore. By sunrise, word had already spread across the village. Thomas Reed had returned, but something had returned with him. No one touched the boat. No one even stepped onto the dock. They simply stood in silence, staring at the enormous wet handprints drying across the weathered wood. The marks weren't made by mud or algae. They looked almost burned into the timber, as though the moisture had soaked deep inside the grain. Old Graham slowly pushed through the crowd. He stopped beside the boat. His face turned pale. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, "It found you." Thomas looked at him. "What is it?" Graham never answered immediately. Instead, he climbed onto the boat. He knelt beside one of the handprints and gently placed his weathered hand beside it. His hand looked like a child's. The difference in size was impossible to ignore. Without another word, he removed his hat, lowered his head, and quietly made the sign of the cross. The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas frowned. "What are you doing?" Graham finally looked up. His voice sounded older than ever. 56 years ago, I saw these exact marks." The word silenced everyone. Thomas stared at him. "You've seen this before?" Graham nodded. "Only once." "And what happened?" The old man took a slow breath. "They all disappeared." That afternoon, Graham asked Thomas to follow him to an abandoned church sitting on a hill overlooking the marsh. The building had been empty for decades. Dust covered every pew. The stained glass windows had long since shattered. Only silence remained. Beneath the old altar, Graham unlocked a heavy wooden chest. Inside were faded newspaper clippings, weathered photographs, and a leather journal whose pages had turned almost brown with age. Thomas carefully picked up the oldest photograph. 6 fishermen stood beside the marsh, all smiling, all unaware. Then he noticed something. Near the edge of the photograph, just beneath the water, 2 enormous dark shapes, almost invisible, watching. Thomas looked closer. "They're underwater." Graham nodded. The picture was taken on a Sunday. He swallowed hard. By Thursday, 5 of those 6 men had vanished. Thomas slowly lowered the photograph. Were their bodies ever found? For 4 of them, no. The 5th? Graham looked toward the church window. They found him floating 3 miles downstream. Thomas waited. There wasn't a single wound on his body. No broken bones. No cuts. No bruises. The doctors ruled it a heart attack. He paused. But they couldn't explain why. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Why what? Graham looked directly into his eyes. Both of his eyes were gone. Silence filled the church. Thomas couldn't speak. Graham opened the old journal. Its pages cracked as he turned them. Near the end, one passage had been underlined several times. Thomas read it aloud. "It doesn't hunt because it's hungry. It waits. The moment you truly see it, it begins seeing you." Thomas stopped reading. His breathing slowed. Very quietly, he admitted. I looked into its eyes. The old man's expression collapsed. For the first time, Thomas saw genuine fear in Graham's face. "Then listen to me carefully." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "It won't stop. Not now. Not ever. Until a deafening scream shattered the silence. It came from outside. Both men rushed from the church. Villagers were running toward the shoreline. Someone pointed toward the center of Blackmire Marsh. The water! It's happening again! Thomas looked. The calm surface had begun spinning, slowly at first, then faster. A perfect circle formed in the middle of the marsh. There was no wind, no storm, yet the water twisted into a deep, unnatural whirlpool. Then, something floated to the surface. An old glass bottle. Its neck was sealed with black wax. It drifted in the exact center of the whirlpool, as though the water itself were holding it in place. Something moved inside, very slowly. Thomas couldn't breathe. He suddenly realized something that terrified him even more than the creature itself. The thing beneath Blackmire Marsh had never arrived there. Someone, long ago, had imprisoned it. The entire village stood frozen. Hundreds of eyes, locked onto the old glass bottle floating at the center of Blackmire Marsh. The water around it was spinning violently, yet the bottle remained perfectly still. No current moved it. No wave touched it. It was as if the marsh itself was protecting it. Thomas felt a cold sensation run through his body, because he remembered everything from the previous night. The enormous shadow beneath the water, the voices calling his name, the floating lanterns, and those impossible eyes staring back at him. Old Graham pushed through the crowd. His face was filled with terror. Nobody goes near it. His voice was shaking, but it was already too late. From the crowd, a young fisherman stepped forward. A confident smile crossed his face. "You're all scared of a bottle?" Several villagers tried to stop him, but he ignored them. "It's just an old piece of glass." He dragged a small wooden boat into the water. The entire shoreline went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They watched as the young fisherman rowed slowly toward the center of the marsh. 10 feet, 5 feet, 3 feet, 1 foot. He reached out his hand and grabbed the bottle. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The fisherman laughed. "See? There's nothing." He never finished the sentence, because a sound came from inside the bottle. A deep, ancient sound, like something that had been trapped for centuries, taking its first breath again. Then, the entire marsh shook. The water beneath the boat began to bubble. Huge waves erupted from nowhere. The small boat started spinning violently. The fisherman grabbed the oars. He pulled with all his strength, but the boat refused to move. Then, something massive moved beneath the black water, a shadow larger than the boat itself. Before anyone could react, the creature rose. A huge force dragged the boat downward. The fisherman screamed. The villagers watched helplessly, and within seconds, everything disappeared. The boat, the fisherman, the sound of his voice, all gone. The water became completely still again. Only one thing remained: his old fishing hat, floating alone on the surface. Panic exploded across the dock. People screamed. Some ran. Some fell to their knees and prayed. But Thomas didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the water, because he finally understood. The creature wasn't killing because it was hungry. It was feeding on something else. Fear. The more people became terrified, the stronger it became. Then, Graham placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "There is still a way." Thomas looked at him. "A way to do what?" The old man reached inside his coat and pulled out a small iron medallion. A strange Celtic symbol was carved into its surface. "The bottle wasn't a container," Graham whispered. "It was a seal." Thomas stared at the object. "A seal?" Graham nodded. "Whoever trapped that thing down there didn't defeat it with strength. They defeated it with deception." He closed Thomas's fingers around the medallion. "Now you have to return it." Thomas said nothing. He simply walked toward the boat. Before he stepped inside, Graham grabbed his arm. His expression became serious. Listen carefully. No matter what you hear, do not turn around. The boat moved slowly toward the center of Blackmire Marsh. The fog returned, thicker than before. The world around Thomas disappeared. Only darkness, only silence. Then, a voice. Soft, familiar. Thomas. He froze. It was Alice. Please, come back. His grip tightened around the oar. He closed his eyes. He kept moving. Then another voice came. Older. Deeper. A voice he hadn't heard in years. His father's voice. Calling him. Begging him to return. Then came the voices of childhood friends. One after another. Every person he had ever loved. Calling from the darkness. But Thomas never looked back. The boat reached the center of the whirlpool. It stopped. Slowly. The water beneath him began to glow. Two enormous eyes opened in the darkness below. Closer than ever before. Thomas could feel their presence. Watching. Waiting. He lifted the iron medallion, and with one final breath, he threw it into the center of the water. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the marsh exploded. A massive column of water shot toward the sky. The entire earth trembled. A horrifying roar echoed across Blackmire Marsh, a sound that felt like it came from somewhere far beneath the world itself. Then, silence. Complete silence. The fog began to disappear. The whirlpool collapsed. The water became calm. The eyes vanished. The shadow was gone. Nothing remained. Over the next few weeks, Blackmire Marsh slowly returned to normal. Fishermen returned to the water. Boats crossed the marsh again. No one disappeared. No one saw the creature. And life continued. But, almost 1 year later, on a cold winter morning, a tourist visited the southern edge of the marsh. He took several photographs of the quiet water. Later that evening, while looking through the pictures, he noticed something strange. His own reflection appeared clearly on the surface, but beneath it, deep below the water, two enormous eyes stared directly back at him. The photograph was examined, studied, investigated, but no explanation was ever found. Maybe the darkness had truly disappeared, or maybe it had only gone deeper, waiting for the next person, who would stand beside the black silent water and stare just a little too long. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Horror Story World, because the next nightmare waiting in the darkness will reveal another terrifying encounter where the line between reality and horror disappears forever. Until then, remember, some stories are not meant to be heard alone.